It was an ordinary Tuesday morning at Ridgeway High School in Ohio. The day had been sluggish, with students half asleep in their second period classes, teachers droning through lectures, and the faint hum of lockers closing down the hall. No one expected anything unusual to happen. That was when the intercom crackled to life with a voice that sounded strangely tense. "Attention, staff and students. The school is now in lockdown. This is not a drill." Those 6 words changed everything. The teacher, Mrs. Carter, quickly sprang into action. She locked the door, turned off the lights, and ushered her students into the far corner of the classroom. Their chatter, at first confused, quickly turned to silence when they saw the fear in her eyes. Usually, lockdowns were boring drills, an inconvenience where everyone had to sit quietly for 15 minutes. But this time felt different. The air seemed heavier, the silence sharper. From the second-floor window, Jake, one of the students, peered out through the blinds. At first, he saw nothing but the empty football field swaying in the wind. Then his eyes caught movement. A man, tall, thin, with a dark jacket, was pacing along the sidelines. His movements were restless, almost jerky, like he didn't belong there. The most chilling detail wasn't his presence but what he carried. In his hand, something metallic glinted each time the sunlight caught it. Jake squinted, trying to see if it was a tool or a weapon. His heart began to race. "Get away from the window, Mrs. Carter whispered sharply, pulling him down. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The only sounds inside the classroom were the muffled breaths of students trying not to panic. Every creak of the old school building seemed louder than usual. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed shut, making a few students flinch. Then it happened. Footsteps, faint, but unmistakable. They echoed through the hallway outside, steady and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. The sound grew louder until it stopped, right outside their classroom door. Every student froze. One girl clutched her friend's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mrs. Carter motioned with a finger to her lips, urging everyone to stay absolutely silent. Then came the sound that made everyone's stomach drop. The handle of the door rattled. Once, twice, slowly, as if someone was testing it. The class collectively held their breath. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended. If the lock failed, there would be nowhere to run. The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was just standing still, waiting. Finally, the footsteps moved again, this time retreating down the hall. No one dared to move until the faint sound had completely disappeared. 30 minutes later, the police arrived. Officers swept through the building, checking every corner and every room. They escorted the students out one class at a time, whispering reassurances that everything was under control. But when Jake finally stepped into the hallway, his eyes widened. The floor tiles near their classroom had faint muddy footprints, prints that hadn't been there before. They trailed off toward the stairwell and disappeared at the exit. The police later confirmed what the students already feared. A stranger had indeed broken into the school. He had slipped past the front entrance, wandered the halls, and then vanished before officers arrived. Even stranger, when they searched the surrounding neighborhood, he was nowhere to be found. Rumors spread fast. Some students swore the man had been carrying a knife. Others whispered he was seen near the lockers days earlier, watching the kids leave after practice. But, the scariest part, the police admitted they had no clue who he was or how he managed to disappear so quickly. The lockdown eventually ended, and classes resumed the next day, but Ridgeway High was never quite the same. Students avoided staying late after school. Teachers double-checked their locks every period. And for Jake, the memory of that metallic glint and the rattle of the doorknob haunted his dreams. Because the intruder was never caught. And sometimes, when the hallways fell quiet, Jake swore he could still hear those footsteps echoing just outside the door. The second story happened in a school in rural Texas, where the building was older than most of the students who walked its halls. It was late evening during band practice, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and brass instruments. The students were rehearsing for the upcoming competition, laughing quietly between notes, when the principal's voice suddenly came over the intercom. "Attention all staff and students, lockdown. Lock all doors immediately. This is not a drill." Confusion erupted for a few seconds before fear set in. Band instruments clattered to the floor, and students froze, unsure whether to hide or follow the teacher's instructions. The music room lights were dimmed, and the students huddled together, their faces pale under the faint glow of the emergency lights. No one spoke. Not a single note of the music remained. At first, it was just the ordinary sounds of an empty building, the occasional creak of the old floorboards, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the rustle of papers in the teacher's office. But then came the dragging sound. It was soft at first, almost like someone was moving a chair across the tiles. But it grew louder and more deliberate. Something heavy was being pulled down the hallway, step by step. The students froze in horror, holding their breath, their eyes wide. No one dared look at the window, where the shadow of the hallway stretched like a dark river. Then, from the corner of the room, they heard it, a whisper. Low, slow, and drawn out, almost like someone calling out names. Emily, David, Daniel. The names belonged to students in the room, and everyone's stomach dropped. There was no way anyone outside could know the names, they hadn't even spoken them aloud. One brave student, Alex, edged toward the small glass window in the door to peek outside. What he saw made him stumble backward, clutching his chest. A shadow was gliding down the hallway, not walking, not running, but floating as if it had no legs at all. Its shape was tall and twisted, darker than the dim emergency lights, moving without a sound except the faint dragging of its feet, or whatever it had in place of feet. The group tried to stay as calm as possible. Phones were silenced, and the door was reinforced with anything they could find. Every minute felt like an hour, every second stretching painfully as they listened to the whispers grow closer, then retreat, and then creep back again. Finally, police arrived, sirens wailing and lights flashing through the band room windows. Officers rushed in, weapons drawn, but the shadow had vanished. The hallways were empty, the dragging sound gone, the whispers silenced. Students slowly emerged, trembling and pale, but no intruder was found. The next day, the principal called the staff into a meeting and played back the security footage from the cameras that covered the hallways. What appeared on the monitor shook everyone to their core. A dark, indistinct shape moved down the hallways exactly as Alex had described, lingering in front of doors and stairwells. But the figure had no face, no distinguishable features, and no footsteps, even when the sound of dragging had been so clear. Teachers whispered nervously among themselves. Some said it could have been a trick of the lights. Others believed it was something far worse. Rumors began to spread among the students that night. Some claimed it was the ghost of a janitor who had died decades ago, still roaming the building. Others whispered about an unknown entity drawn to the school's energy, feeding off fear and uncertainty. Emily, whose name had been called in the whispers, said she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching her even after the lockdown ended. She refused to stay late for rehearsals again. Others admitted they couldn't bring themselves to walk down the hallways without checking every classroom, every closet, and every corner for that dark shape. Even months later, the students reported seeing fleeting shadows out of the corner of their eyes, glimpses of a figure that vanished whenever they turned their heads. Teachers admitted the emergency lights sometimes flickered in strange ways, revealing shapes that shouldn't have been there. The school was officially deemed safe by the authorities, but everyone knew, deep down, that something had walked its halls that night, and nothing explained what or who it had been. The memory of the whispers, the dragging sound, and the faceless shadow lingered, haunting students long after the building was emptied. And for anyone who passed by the school after dark, They would sometimes swear they could hear the soft call of names carried on the wind, echoing from the deserted hallways. The final story comes from a middle school in Florida, a place that had always been considered safe by parents and staff alike. It was a stormy afternoon, the kind where the rain lashes against the windows and the wind howls through the trees, making the entire building creak and groan. Students were already restless from being cooped up inside, and the distant rumble of thunder added an uneasy soundtrack to their day. It started like any other storm day, with teachers trying to maintain order and students fidgeting at the desks. That's when the principal's voice came over the intercom. "Attention all staff and students. Lockdown immediately. There is a suspicious person reported near the gym. This is not a drill." The announcement caused panic to ripple through the school. Teachers hustled students into the nearest classrooms, locking doors and turning off lights. The emergency lights flickered, casting long shadows across the floors and walls, making the familiar hallways look like a twisted maze. Students huddled in corners, whispering prayers and clutching each other, while the storm pounded on the roof above. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The sound of rain against the windows masked most other noises, and the only movement came from the trees bending in the wind outside. But then came the first sign that this lockdown was different. A faint sound of wet footsteps echoed in the hallway, sloppy, deliberate, unmistakably human. They grew closer, and soon everyone in the classroom could hear them more clearly. Muddy footprints began appearing on the floor outside the door, left by someone who had clearly entered from the stormy outdoors. The prints were fresh, the mud glistening under the emergency lights, leading directly to the classroom door. The students froze in terror. Nobody dared to speak or move. The prints stopped right at the door, as if the person, or something, had simply disappeared. A cold draft seeped through the cracks, making the hair on their arms stand on end. Minutes dragged on. Every second was filled with the sound of the storm outside and the pounding of their own hearts. Then, a distant, almost whispering voice floated through the room. It was faint, barely audible over the thunder, but unmistakably there. Some of the students swore they heard it calling names they didn't even know the speaker could possibly know. By the time the police arrived, storm-soaked and flashing their lights through the windows, the hallway was empty again. Officers searched every corner of the building, calling out into classrooms and closets, but no intruder was found. The muddy prints were gone, wiped clean as if they had never existed. Later, the principal shared something that made the skin crawl even further. The description of the man had matched a former janitor who had worked at the school decades earlier. He had died under mysterious circumstances on school grounds, and rumors had long suggested that his spirit never left. Some believed he had been protective, while others whispered he was vengeful. The students, who had already been terrified, felt an even deeper chill knowing they may have been in the presence of something supernatural. Despite the police declaring the school safe, strange occurrences continued in the following weeks. Teachers reported lights flickering in hallways with no apparent cause. Students claimed to see fleeting shadows at the end of corridors or hear the names called softly when no one else was around. Some said the lockers rattled on their own, and doors would occasionally open or close without anyone touching them. The stormy lockdown became a permanent scar in the minds of everyone who experienced it. Students avoided staying late at school, teachers double-checked every door before leaving, and a sense of unease settled over the building like a fog. Parents whispered about the haunted janitor, and the story spread throughout the town, growing darker with each retelling. Even years later, some students who had been in the lockdown swore that walking past the school after dark gave them an icy sensation, like invisible eyes were following their every move. They would hear the soft sound of footsteps or the faint whisper of a name in the wind, and a shiver would run down their spine. No one could explain it, and the police never had any answers. What made the story truly terrifying wasn't just the lockdown or the storm, it was the realization that the school, a place meant to be safe, could hide secrets no one had ever imagined. And in those dimly lit hallways, with the storm raging outside, students had felt the undeniable presence of something that should not have been there. Something that, according to some, still walks the halls of that Florida middle school to this day.